Can we circle back to enrichment? You had mentioned enrichment, and I wanted to come to a little bit of the difference between enrichment and acceleration, depth versus breadth, because we may encounter students that are advanced ahead of their peers, and we want to be able to continue to challenge them at their level of readiness. But as teachers, we also need to be mindful of where are we sending them next? Because it would seem to be the simple solution that if they finish the third grade math book, we should give them the fourth grade math book. But we need to think about what are they doing in fourth grade? Is fourth grade going to be prepared for that if they've already done it? As a student myself, I was accelerated in elementary school, but then when I went on to middle school, there was no plan whatsoever. And it was basically taking a student who was at 8th grade level and dumping them back into 5th grade. And it was 3 years of repeat with no thought of challenge, no thought of appropriate instruction. And we don't want to do that to our students. We want to make sure that we're giving them appropriate challenges that are connected to their level of content, but lateral challenges.
So that's the breadth, isn't it, that you mentioned?
Yes. For example, in place value system, if their place value system lessons are teaching decimals to tenths and hundredths, we could talk about the place value system to its infinite values on both sides, trillions, quadrillions, and so on. We could go into scientific notation. Khan Academy has great resources for that.
What I found with gifted learners, they often want to know how a formula is derived so that they can make sense of it before they can use it, instead of just memorizing stuff.
Oh, yes. And we can also look at the connections between different fields, interdisciplinary connections. For example, the base 10 system, if we connect that to base 2 and base mathematics, then you're talking binary code, and then you're talking about computer languages. And there are hands-on explorations they can do with that if you look at code.org. And then there are hands-on manipulatives if you look at the Turing Tumble manipulative games. Those are additional resources that are appropriate even for fairly young children.
And actually, sometimes you can even link between subjects. It doesn't have to be restricted to that particular subject. Like math and art could produce really wonderful stuff. Right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Math and art. When the schools closed for pandemic, one of the things that I started offering very early on, like by the second day of closure, was I did a math art group. That ended up being my largest attendance, and it was just different math and art connections, from tessellations to knot designs to similar triangles and how to cut and construct similar triangles to create dragons, all possibilities.
On top of that, we also can link it to history of maths, and how things link from one to another to civilization. And there's many ways that we can make, extension and enrichment to incorporate all these insights instead of just accelerating, giving them a head start. Other ways that we could challenge our gifted learners would be to adopt this intellectual risk-taking. That's something that everyone could definitely benefit from, not just gifted learners. Just to give a little bit of a taste of that is to have the idea that it's okay to be wrong sometimes. And it's okay to guess when you can't find out any other way.
Actually, just yesterday, I ran into a situation with that where one of my younger students was in the art room and was having a very sad time because he was having difficulty drawing a star. And it was just not living up to what he knew it could be.
Yeah.
And yet this is a child who is not used to having difficulty. He is used to being right.
How can we help, them to moving on to having to a sort of a growth mindset or an intellectual risk-taking mindset? What can we say to them?
That's one of the phrases that we try to use a lot, is when we say, I don't know, we say, I don't know yet. We try to always add that on. I don't know yet. I can't do that yet.
Even as teachers and adults, I think that's something important for us to have, not just for learners.
Mm-hmm.
And also the fact that the teacher is not always right, It might be hard for some teachers to adopt this mindset, but this is actually one of the secrets to get the gifted learners to sort of be interested. even to some level of respect of a teacher, because they are as curious as them, they're open to learning like them. And we could say we could learn it together.
That is absolutely something that happens here with my students. Is I am ready to say, I don't know about that. Maybe you can tell me.
Yeah. And I think that could definitely gain trust from the gifted learners, and as opposed to, oh, you don't need to know this, or this is so irrelevant. Maybe we can't see the relevance, but maybe give them a chance to show how it's relevant, or maybe take it after the class instead of, just dismissing them, or some even get punished for it, sadly.
Mm-hmm. So how could we sum all this up? What would you say are our most important takeaways here? I'm thinking it sounds like we need to really respect the students in terms of what they bring to the table. And at the same time, we need to be able to challenge them to continue pressing themselves forward rather than being complacent because it's easy.
And also that the idea that there may be more than one right answer, or more than one way to do something, or there's many things yet to be discovered.
And also, if a student is not satisfied with an answer, I think we should absolutely be willing to check that answer and encourage them to check that answer. We need to absolutely be open to that sort of investigation. Challenge the resources.
Yeah, or at least put forward that point to those setting the curriculum, Don't be a gatekeeper, right?
All right, Kristen, so after listening to your comments about teaching strategies, how would you approach applying this at schools or within districts?
Well, when I speak to a district that is looking to set up a G&T program, the first thing that the teachers need access to their students. It's really surprising how many teachers who are designated as teachers of gifted and talented can't see their students, or they have access to the students during recess, or access to the younger students during playtime, or during other very appealing sections, such as a middle school teacher may be able to offer a G&T unit, but it's opposite the other special times. So the students have to choose to be gifted or musical, or gifted or artistic. So teachers need to have access to their students on a regular basis and have it built into the schedules, and preferably have it woven in to the instructional time. Teachers need to be trained, educated in terms of the field, and then their administrators need to be supportive in terms of training those teachers. Now, even with it being in code, for example, the New Jersey state law strengthening gifted and talented education code was passed, I think, 2020, and then pandemic hit, and it has been very difficult to get it enforced. All districts are to have all teachers across all areas trained in gifted and talented pedagogy, student needs, and yet it's actually quite unusual for that to be occurring. So the state is working towards increasing the accountability of districts, but it is a slow process. And honestly, it's not just the teachers, it's that the administrators are not educated to this. They may not see the need to change what they think has been working.
So it sounds like progress on this might be slow because it all comes down to information, and it has to go through a lot of channels with all the teachers, with the administration, with the state, before people are really going to prioritize or understand the importance of gifted education within their school districts.
Absolutely. So for administrators to see that gifted students are more than a potential source of high test scores is a shift in thinking. That is not really what gifted education is about. Challenges faced by gifted kids that have to do with all their SEL needs, that have to do with their own perfectionism, that may have to do with the slower processing speeds because they're thinking very deeply, or very quick processing speeds that make it difficult for them to work in tedious situations. These things are not necessarily very compatible with high test scores.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of skills within some of the gifted community that are really difficult to quantify. And if you can't do that, it's really hard to get funding or to get people to really passionate about whatever needs to change.
And funding is another question there as well. In the national policy for the US, there's the JAVITS funding that had come in federal law years ago, but it's always a question whether there will be JAVITS funding. Another potential funding source, at least for the gifted and talented identification and possibly for services, could be Title III funding, which is EL students, if we are looking at diversity and representation, because part of the recommendations for gifted learners are that we need to include students who are multilingual learners. I have seen in the last couple of years 2 or 3 cases in my own district of students who have been new immigrants to our community, and within 2 years, they are scoring the very top scores of the grade level cohort in the English language arts state tests.
Wow.
And it is not their own language. So those students are definitely gifted and should be served. And coming back around to funding, that Title III funding to serve multilingual learners, perhaps part of that can be directed toward gifted learners. But that, again, is a challenge to convince administrators who are looking at all these needs at the same time.
I think what you're saying, you're talking about the importance of recognition and diversity and awareness within various communities. It really underscores the claim that Susan Baum and her colleagues make in their book, To Be Gifted and Learning Disabled, because they speak on the fact that parents with sufficient financial means express a lot of frustration when it comes to finding knowledgeable people, quality information, service, things around the topic, let alone for low-income families, English language learners, and poorly or minimally educated families. It's almost impossible.
That is another issue for district accountability in terms of representation. And one of the things that I do for the New Jersey Principals and Supervisors Association is part of a webinar series for them, where my piece is the equity audit, guiding our attendees through how to conduct an equity audit on their gifted and talented rosters, where they look at the students who are identified as gifted and compare it to their local demographics. So, for example, if I have in my school, say 50% multilingual learners, and then in my gifted and talented program, I am looking at the roster and I only have, say, 10% multilingual learners, that is really an issue. By representation index, according to Gentry, it should be closer to maybe even a 40%, because that's within that range that she is suggesting, if I was doing an adequate job of finding them. And there are tools that are more appropriate to use to find students from diverse backgrounds. For example, the Slocum Payne Teacher Perception Inventory is a survey tool that allows teachers to rate students in terms of behaviors, learning behaviors, attitudes, and yet it presents each attribute as a positive or a negative, because it might be expressed differently among different populations or among those who haven't yet assimilated into local cultural norms.
Mm-hmm.
Also, there are different tests for giftedness that are very carefully constructed to be more free of cultural bias. So I would advise administrators to be cautious about making sure what they're looking at is one that is appropriate to their demographics. And
I think that's a really great point. That's not even something that I had considered before. It's not only is the assessment in general and the knowledge around the topic important for all communities, it's important to make sure that the context of the content is also relevant to the individuals, because that could create a lot of variation otherwise. And, so wrapping up, it just seems like there's a lot of room for improvement when it comes to creating a more equitable approach to how we improve our education for gifted learners. What's your key takeaway?
Well, I think it's both room for improvement, and also once one has gained ground or established some strengths in your local programming, create a network among your constituency, and then remain vigilant, because change happens. There's nothing permanent but change.